Welcome to Lesson 4 on Filing Status, Dependents, and Exemptions. Publication 4012 is a great resource that's available throughout the entire training process. You can find it online, and you can also use it while taking the test. You can download it from the link on the screen, or the first time you get to a volunteer location, it will be made available to you at the tax site. The first thing that we're going to be talking about today is filing status. Why is filing status important? There are so many different options, as you can see here on the screen. You could do married filing joint, married filing separate, qualifying widower, but why does it matter? Filing status matters because there's a standard deduction tied to the filing status. So each filing status has a different standard deduction, and the standard deduction is a set dollar amount that's going to lower your taxable income. So for someone who's married filing joint on their tax return, they're going to have $12,600 off of their taxable income this year. That's the same amount for a qualifying widow or widower, and it only goes down from there. Head of household is the next highest at $9,300 this year, and single and married filing separate have the same amount at $6,300. So it is important that we determine the correct filing status to make sure that we are giving someone the most advantageous amount in standard deduction, lowering their taxable income. So you'll always start at the top of the filing status decision tree, asking, were you married on the last day of the year? If yes, you're usually going to do married filing separate or married filing joint. However, there is one question in here: did you live apart from your spouse all of the last 6 months of the year? If you're not living with your spouse, you may have the option to file it as head of household rather than married filing separate or married filing joint, depending on what the situation is at home. So that comes up on occasion at our tax sites, but not very often. So just follow the rules on the filing status decision tree to determine if someone who is married has to file married filing separate or married filing joint. If someone's not married, we're looking to find out, well, are we doing head of household, single, or qualifying widow? Qualifying widow is going to be someone whose spouse died during 2014 or 2015, and they have a dependent at home that they're taking care of. Single is someone that's not married with no dependents, and head of household is someone that's not married but has dependents. So, what is a dependent in tax terms? The next chart is page C3 of your 4012, and it goes through tests to be a qualifying child and tests to be a qualifying relative. You're always going to start with tests to be a qualifying child first. And the reason for that is, if you have a qualifying child, you get an extra $4,050 off your taxable income. It's called an exemption for each person on the tax return. So for each child you're putting on the tax return, you get $4,050 more off your taxable income, in addition to that standard deduction we already talked about. And the exemptions are for each person on the return. You get one for the taxpayer, the spouse if there is one, and then every qualifying child and every qualifying relative on the return. However, qualifying child is also going to bump you from single, if you are single, to the head of household status, whereas tests to be a qualifying relative, even if you meet all of those tests, you may get that extra exemption on your tax return, but you may still have to file as single. So we'll talk about that a little bit as we move forward. But first, let's go through the test to be a qualifying child. Test 1, this is the relationship test. If you have a copy of this in front of you, write relationship test in that box. It's a little cheat to help you when you need to refer to this at the tax site. You won't need to read through each test every time. So this first test is basically saying the child is your son, daughter, stepchild, foster child, a sibling, or a descendant of any of them. Test 2, this is the age test. It's the test that says the child must be under age 19 and younger than you, or if they're a full-time student, they can be under age 24. They still have to be younger than you. or if they're permanently and totally disabled, there is no age test. So you may have a sibling that's older than you, but you're taking care of them because they're permanently and totally disabled. They will still pass this age test. Number 3 is the residency test. The child must have lived with the taxpayer for more than half of the year. So this can get tricky sometimes if there's joint custody, but it's whoever the child lived with the longest, and that's going to pass that residency test. Number 4 is the support test. The support test says that the child must not have provided more than half of his or her own support for the year. So a child that is supporting themselves is not going to go on anyone else's tax return. They're not going to meet the qualifying child test. So when is a child supporting themselves? Well, maybe in a rare occasion you'll see children who are receiving Social Security disability in their own name. They might be considered supporting themselves if their parents are using that money to pay household bills. Or maybe it's an older child under the age of 19 still, but maybe they're working full-time and helping to pay to support the household. Not very often are you going to see this, but it is something to keep in mind. Number 5 here is saying that the child isn't filing a joint return for the year. So we don't generally see this at our tax sites, but usually if the child's married, the parents probably aren't claiming them on their tax return. And then number 6, if the child meets the rules of being a qualifying child for more than one person, then you're going to have to move on to even more tests, and we'll look at those in a little bit. So now let's look at tests to being a qualifying relative. The first one is saying that the person cannot be someone else's qualifying child. And number 2 is the relationship or residency test, and that or is really important. So it's saying that the person must A, be related to you in one of the ways listed under relatives who do not have to live with you, and that's in another table again, so you'll have to refer to that in a little bit. But what's easy to remember is if you go back to the relationship test under qualifying child, you're going to have all of those included as well as parents. So we'll look at that in a little bit. But if they're not related to you, then we're going to look at letter B here. They must have lived with you all year as a member of your household. So it's relationship or residency test. Qualifying relative doesn't actually have to be related to you, so the name is a little bit misleading. Number 3 here is the income test. There's an income test for qualifying relatives. The person has to have made under $4,050 throughout the year, but it does have certain exclusions, so Social Security is typically not going to exceed that amount. If you read here, it says, do not include Social Security benefits unless the person is married, filing a separate return, and lived with their spouse at any time during the tax year, or if half of the Social Security benefits plus their other gross income and tax exempt income is more than $25,000. The next test is the support test. You have to be providing more than half the person's support. Once again, our tax sites are designed to serve low-income individuals, so very rarely will you see anybody who passes that Social Security income test. And if they are, our clients aren't generally going to be the ones supporting these types of people typically. So keep that in mind when you're doing the test to be a qualifying relative. I mentioned in the last slide that there's extra tests if the child meets the test of being a qualifying child of more than one person. So what's important here is that only one person is going to claim a child and all the credits that go along with that child. There's no splitting credits. There are some tiebreaker rules on this page. Tiebreaker 1 is parents are going to get the first chance at claiming the child. So if there's a grandparent and a parent who are both supporting the child and they both want to put the child on the tax return, parents get the first chance. Tiebreaker 2 is which person did the child live with the longest, and this is counted by nights spent in the home. And tiebreaker 3, if we still haven't solved anything because it's split perfectly down the year for nights and home, and it's parents fighting over who gets to claim the credit, then we're going to look at who had the higher adjusted gross income, and that parent is going to claim the child on their tax return. And thinking back to our test to be a qualifying relative, we talked about how not every qualifying relative is going to get you head of household filing status. So this is from page B3 of the 4012. Which people on the tax return are going to get you head of household filing status over the single filing status? Box 1, we're looking at qualifying children, specifically qualifying child, is almost always going to get you head of household filing status. So we're going to skip past this one. It's only very rare occasions that it won't get you head of household filing status. So box 2, a qualifying relative who is your father or mother. This says you can claim an exemption for him or her, so if you're putting them on your tax return as a qualifying relative, then you're going to get head of household filing status if they're related to you as your father or mother. And then the next one is for any other type of qualifying relative who's not your parent. So now we're looking at a person who must have lived with you for more than half of the year and be related to you as your child, grandchild, niece, nephew, sibling, aunt, uncle, or parent in order to claim head of household filing status. Anybody else that's a qualifying relative, you're going to be filing single if you're not married. This married filing separately filing status, there are some restrictions. So we typically at our tax sites are going to encourage people to file a joint return if possible, because most of our low-income clients are going to miss out on a refund if they file married filing separately. So firstly, the restriction of this filing status is there's a disallowance of certain credits and deductions if the people that are married filing separately would have qualified for the earned income tax credit, for example. They're not going to be able to claim that credit unless they file a joint return. The Social Security number and name of the spouse are required for electronic filing, so a lot of times when people are doing married filing separately, it's because they can't make it to the site together or they don't talk anymore. So we'll still need to put everyone's information on the tax return if they want to electronically file. Otherwise, they're going to have to paper file, and that will slow down their refund a little bit. Another restriction of married filing separately is that if one spouse takes the standard deduction, then the other spouse has to take the standard deduction as well. Otherwise, there's the option of doing itemized deductions, but they have to agree on what form of deductions they're going to take on their tax return. And if they're living together and they're doing married filing separately, their Social Security income is going to become fully taxable. The other option for people who are married filing separately may be to fill out an injured spouse form. Sometimes people are doing married filing separately because one of the taxpayer owes the government money on student loans, for example, that they got behind on, or child support. So if that's the case, they may want to fill out an injured spouse form instead of doing married filing separately. All of that is covered in a video later titled Injured Spouse, so please watch that if you have more questions. Now we're going to run through a couple practice scenarios. This first one here, we've got Jamal and Jamie. They're not married and have lived together for 4 years. They have 2 3-year-old twins. Jamal works and makes $12,000 a year, and Jamie works and makes $4,500 a year. They both believe they're paying at least half the cost of keeping up the home. So one question we need to look at is, what is each person's filing status? We can go back to the filing status decision tree and go down the questions for each of them. Let's start here with Jamal. Were you married on the last day of the year? No. Did your spouse die during the year? No. Do all of the following apply? Your spouse died in 2014 or 2015? Well, that's a no, so we can skip this one and go to the next one. And do both of the following apply? You paid more than half the cost of keeping up the home for the year, and you have a qualifying person as defined on page B3 of the 4012. So we don't know who kept up the cost of the home. They both believe they did. So let's go back and look at another worksheet. This worksheet can also be found in the 4012 on page B4. You can use this to determine who's paying the expenses that qualify toward keeping up a home. Once you go through this with the taxpayers, it's easy to determine who's keeping up the home as long as they're agreeing on who's actually paying the expenses. Since Jamal's making a lot more than Jamie, we can assume that once we go through this chart with them, he'll be the one who's keeping up the home. So what we have to remember here is only one person is allowed to claim head of household. The other person must file as single. Most likely we're going to put Jamal as head of household because it would be more beneficial to him to claim the children anyways, because he's going to get a higher earned income tax credit than Jamie. But if they want, they could split the twins. They could each claim a twin. Really, either of them are allowed to claim the children, but who is it going to be more beneficial for? And who's technically head of household needs to be determined by going through the cost of keeping up the home, as well as the test to be a qualifying child and qualifying relative. Let's go through another scenario. Here we have Hector, who takes care of his 8-year-old niece for 7 months out of the year. He says that his brother has 3 other kids to take care of, and he takes his niece to help the family out. So what type of questions are we going to ask Hector to determine his filing status and his ability to claim his niece? Well, at the tax site, every taxpayer is going to fill out an intake and interview form. And in the intake and interview form, you're going to list everybody who lives in the household. And then there's a little snippet of that to be completed by the certified volunteer. This is where you come in. These are questions to help get the conversation started in determining whether or not we can claim his niece as a qualifying relative or a qualifying child. So you're going to run through this section with every single taxpayer who comes in and has people listed in that section of the intake and interview form. And these questions will help you answer the questions on this page. So let's go down the tests of being a qualifying child, where we'll always start. Does his niece meet the relationship test? It's number 1 there. Son, daughter, stepchild, foster child, brother, sister, half-brother, half-sister, or a descendant of any of them. Well, we have the niece who's the descendant of his brother, so yes, she meets the relationship test. Test number 2, does she meet the age test? She is younger than the age of 19 at the end of the year and younger than Hector, so yes, she meets the age test. Does she meet the residency test? The child must have lived with Hector for more than half the year. 7 months is more than half of the year, so yes. And the support test. The child must not have provided more than half of his or her own support. And we would need to ask Hector that, which we did when we were filling this portion of the intake and interview form out. So we'll say yes, we passed that test as well. So we have a qualifying child for Hector's tax return. Now the question is he single or is he head of household? So back to B3 of the 4012, we're going to look at that first section there for qualifying child. Is the qualifying child single? Well, she's 8 years old, so yes. So we have a qualifying person for head of household. So Hector can claim his niece, and he can claim the head of household filing status. The last practice scenario is about Cammie. Cammie's 87 years old and is considered permanently disabled. She does not work, and she receives $10,000 a year in Social Security income. All of her income is used on medical bills. She lives with her daughter, Patrice. Patrice pays all the costs of keeping up the home. So what is Patrice's filing status, and how many exemptions will Patrice take? So Can Patrice claim her mother, Cammie, on the tax return? Let's look at a chart for the test to being a qualifying relative and qualifying child from our 4012. Test 1. The person cannot be your qualifying child or the qualifying child of any other taxpayer. Well, we know that Cammie is not going to be a qualifying child, so we're going to look down the qualifying relative column here. Test 2. The person either A, must be related to you in one of the ways listed under relatives who do not have to live with you, and we know that Patrice and Cammie live together and are related, so they're going to pass both of these tests. And test number 3 is the income test. This one is a little tricky because we have Cammie receiving $10,000 a year in Social Security income. So let's look closely here. It says, do not include Social Security benefits unless the person is married, filing a separate return, and living with their spouse at any time during the tax year. Well, we know that that doesn't apply here, so let's look at the next portion. Or if half the Social Security benefits plus their other income and the tax-exempt interest is more than $25,000. Well, she only had $10,000 in Social Security income, so she's going to pass the income test. And the last test is the support test. You must provide more than half of the person's total support. Since her mother is exclusively using her income for medical bills, we would need to determine if other support, such as housing, food, utilities, and clothing costs, took up more than half the costs of support in order to determine if she can claim her mother. We can go back to the chart on B4 of the 4012 and go through this with them to determine who is providing more than half of her support. So can Patrice file head of household? We know she can claim Cammie, but will she file as single or head of household? We're going to look at the second box here, qualifying relative who is your father or mother. You can claim an exemption for him or her, so we have a qualifying person for head of household. So that's the last scenario in today's video, and it wraps up our training. Thank you for watching, and if you have any questions, you can contact volunteer@refundohio.org. Thank you.